very much, and thank you for Chelsea Green for putting this on. This is such an important topic, an important issue. It's the one thing we do 3 or more times a day, eat. We can't be without it. So it's critical that we actually are talking and learning and reading and sharing about food systems. So my name is Vicki Hird. I've written this book with Chelsea Green, Rebugging the Planet. But I'm not trying to get people to love the invertebrates and do things for them. But that's not what we're here to talk about. Although I obviously think invertebrates are at the centre of everything. They're not. They're obviously important. But I'm an entomologist by background. But my day job is as head of farming for an organisation called Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. And I've been working on farm policy for 30 years. The original thing that drove me to it was the bugs, actually, because I did a master's in pest management. But I've just been I haven't been a farmer, apart from a very small period of time with tomatoes, but it's the bugs and nature and solving the environmental crises that we're under that have driven me to work on farm and food policy, because in the UK, 70% of the land is farmed. We've really got to get it right. But I'm not a farmer, and what I find absolutely appalling over the last sort of 30 years is the growth of very intensive livestock systems, harming the really good livestock systems that I know they can be. And I think the other big horror show, although I've been trying to alleviate it a little bit, is the rise of the retailers and the incredible concentration of power in a very small number of hands in the food system. And that's one of the things that we might want to talk about today. But we're here to talk about meat, but it's about the very many things that influence our meat consumption and the whole meat system as where it is now. All that matters, and it matters more than ever because of climate change and because of the nature crisis. So making good farming survive and thrive is critical. And I'm so worried about the debate getting too polarised. It's not helpful if it's polarised. We know there is a way to do this. And the extremes are not helpful. But here we want to listen. We can have a lively debate, have a lively discussion from you. So think about your questions that you might want to ask. But we wanted to make it respectful. Or listen even if you don't agree with what people may be saying. So I'm really pleased to be sitting here with 2 amazing writers. I've read both their books. They're really, really worth reading. Definitely recommend them. They come from very different places and they've got very different approaches. But I'll let them explain why they wrote them. But it's absolutely critical this time that we understand these things that they're talking about in their books and sharing. You could be ambassadors for the right kind of thing. And they come from a sector now, both have a legal background, which you might want to talk about, come from legal backgrounds, you can read their biographies in the books, but are now working in farming. So I think that's an amazing thing. I've not ever been a farmer, but these 2 are farmers, so we should be listening to them. And that's a sector under huge pressure, right now under huge pressure. So without further ado, I wanted to ask our speakers, already got a very dry mouth, to talk to us a bit about the motivation for writing their books. And maybe I'll start with you, Sarah. Sarah Langford has written Rooted, and I think I'll leave you to explain who you are and why you wrote the book.
Thanks. My name is Sarah Langford, and I think if you told me that I was be sitting in London talking about farming 5 years ago, I would wonder what went wrong, because I was a criminal barrister for 10 years. I mostly represented defendants, and I represented family law parents who were having their children removed by the state, and I lived in London and I had a very urban life. And then I did a really foolish thing if you're a court-based barrister, which is to have children, because they don't really go very well together. And as a result of that, I ended up writing my first book, which is called In Your Defence, which was a narrative non-fiction account of being a barrister, and it tried to make something which had been flattened a 3-dimensional, human-based, story-based topic. While I was writing that, we had another life pivot, which is my husband lost his job, and we found ourselves in London with 2 very small kids and no income. So we decided to move to Suffolk, where he grew up, where we had been going back and forward for years. And we thought we would be there for 6 months, and while we were there, we thought we asked to take on his parents' farm, which is very small, 200 acres, mostly arable and a bit of pasture. 2 years later, we returned to London as farmers and farm managers, and we're still farming it, and I'm currently an agricultural student at Cirencester, which is more funny for my dad, who went there 40 years ago to learn how to be a land agent. And while I was writing my first book, and that was being published, I was immersing myself by necessity in the farming world around me, and finding also some echoes of my past, because my grandparents were farmers. They were tenant farmers in Hampshire, and my uncle took on that farm. He is a loud voice in farming because he's had a column in Farmers Weekly, which is the trade rag, for 25 years. And he is the archetypal bad farmer. He is large, ginger, and angry about everything. And he says he is very wedded and committed to his belief, which is we need to use as many chemicals and machinery as possible to feed a growing world. But while I was trying to learn how to farm, I started to see things differently from how I had been seeing them in the city for 10 years. And so when my literary agent came to me and said, obviously you're going to write a crime fiction novel next, because that's a sensible route for a criminal barrister and it really sells really well, I said to her, I think I want to write about farming. So when she went, absolutely no way, that's incredibly boring, no one's going to read that. And I eventually talked her around, so this was in 2019, and I said, the thing about farming is it isn't just about farming, it's about everything. All life is there, but it's also not just about the food we eat, but therefore our health, but it's about our connection with the natural world, which is, of course, everything, because we depend on that connection for our own survival. It's about whose voices we hear and whose we don't hear, because whilst farmers farm 70% of our land, they make up 1% of our workforce in England. And I have been a defence advocate for a decade. I am drawn to the voices of people who don't really get heard that much. And so I thought, rather than writing a crime fiction novel where another woman was murdered, I thought I would instead try to tell the stories of some of the farmers that I had met in learning how to farm our farm. And they were regenerative. A lot of farmers in the book are regenerative. Some of them, my uncle, for example, are not. And I wanted to get across the voices of those people who had found themselves farming in a certain way and why they found themselves farming in that way, and the situation they were now presented with, which looked to me very much like a trap. So why they made the choices that they did. And the point of Rooted is to tell, I suppose, my own story, because it's spliced with memoir, about how I refound a connection with the natural world that I had lost entirely through being in the city, and what that brought to my life, but also the voices of lots of farmers from all over the country that I met who were starting a quiet revolution in pockets all over the countryside against the odds in most circumstances, and that gave me great hope for where farming could go, because we are, I believe, in England, a test case. Our farming subsidies are being withdrawn. Farmers will no longer get money for growing food. They'll get money, public money for public good, which applies only to natural resources. So for the first time in an extremely long time, food is not a public good, it's a public given. So how we do this now could provide a blueprint for how it's done around the world if we have both the public and political support behind it. So
that's great. Yeah, that reminds me, the Farm Minister, now ex-Farm Minister, Victoria Prentice, said she went to a G7 meeting and they all came up to her and said, how's the revolution going? Because they're introducing something quite revolutionary in England. Other nations doing something different. But I think in this book you capture those stories incredibly well, and we'll talk about some of those, I think, later if we can. But they're all different, and they're fascinating in terms of exposing some of the problems that we've got to get over here. But I want to ask Nicolette Niman. She's written the book Defending Beef, which I'd heard about some time ago. It's an amazing book, full, unbelievably rammed with amazing amount of research on why beef and grass should be really defended, should be supported, and should be celebrated everywhere. And I think making an ecological and nutritional case for meat. So can you tell us why you started writing it? Because you also has a legal background.
Yes, well actually the parallels between our lives are kind of astonishing. Not only are we both attorneys and both have 2 sons, but I was also living in the city. I was living in New York City, in fact, working on, as an environmental lawyer, working on specifically the issue of meat and how it's produced. And advocating, from the environmentalist perspective, not exactly against meat, but really focused on the problems with meat production, and especially large, concentrated industrial production. And I thought I knew a lot about the topic. But when I married Bill Niman, which was very interesting because Bill Niman is the founder of the natural meat company in the United States called Niman Ranch, which is kind of the premier natural meat company in the United States. And it's a network of somewhere between, depending on what moment you're looking at it, but between 700 and 900 farmers and ranchers from around the United States, all using, we could loosely say, regenerative practices, but basically grass-based raising of animals, and to a very high animal welfare standard. And I met him as I was Bill Niman, the founder of that company, when I was living in New York City, working for the environmental group Waterkeeper, and wearing high heels every day, and living right in the heart of New York City, and was a vegetarian, and was I had a biology undergraduate degree in college. So I kind of thought I knew a lot about this issue. But then I married Bill Niman, a meat industry CEO and founder and cattle rancher, and I moved to California. And it was at that point that a whole different part of my education began. So I had this sort of realization that I was really lacking in a lot of the understanding that I really needed to gain. And, I think I give my husband a lot of credit because not only was he willing to marry a vegetarian, but he also never tried to push me away from being a vegetarian. We've now been married for 19 years, and in all those years, he never told me, you really should be eating meat. What he did say sometimes is, I'm sort of sad that I don't get to share this with you. There was sort of that, but there was no pressure you should be eating meat. And when I had our 2 children, I did, and one of my children is in the back of the room there, Miles, wave, he's 13, and he's a very seasoned traveler and been to the UK before this trip as well, but he's super enjoying our time here. Not this particular moment. He's enjoying this trip. But when we had the children, I knew I wanted to feed them omnivorously because I believe so strongly in the nourishment, the value of meat and all the animal-based foods. So I didn't restrict, their diet in that way, but I continued to be a vegetarian for 33 years, and I only became an omnivore again, as I was raised by my parents, a few years ago, about 3 years ago now. So I have this kind of unusual collection of experiences, both working and living on a ranch now for 19 years, working as an environmental lawyer, living as a vegetarian, but also now really being someone who's thought about why maybe I should be eating meat again and sort of returning to it based on a lot of different considerations. So my kind of niche, I wrote a book about 15 years ago now called Righteous Pork Chop, which really describes the industrialization of the meat industry, especially in the United States, but kind of looking across the globe in the industrialized world, and kind of explained and explored why that happened and the sort of trap that farmers were finding themselves in, and the sort of narrowed range of choices people were finding themselves confronted with who wanted to be involved in agriculture or whose families had been involved. And I had people like a farmer in Iowa, Jim Brown, that I had spent a lot of time talking to, who I shared a lot of values with, but who had become a confinement pig farmer over the years, precisely because of these kinds of issues. And someone who I sort of felt tremendous kinship on so many levels with, but yet he was doing something that I really thought was not okay in terms of his production systems. So I began to just really grapple with all of that, and I wrote the first book, Righteous Pork Chop, and then I've written the subsequent book, Defending Beef, this new version that's just come out. Chelsea Green asked me to do a new version, and I said I would love to do it, and I can take about 3 months and get it done. And then after about a month, I called them and said I need a year. That was not realistic, because I realized there was so much more I wanted to say, actually, from the original book. So I think the current book really reflects my current thinking about this tension between sort of we want to have an ecologically sound food system, and what does that mean? What is really involved in that? And in the original book, I was more focused on sort of like cattle are important, beef is important, here's why. And the more I thought about it over the years, I really wanted to talk about how do we construct a food system that is just, humane, ecologically sound, and produces really nourishing food. And that's more what this book is about. I mean, they're not radically different books, but it's quite evolved from my original book. So I'm kind of very excited to have the opportunity to talk about it and to talk to all of you tonight about this.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's amazing to have two such heavyweights, actually, here, but also representing a,
It's very funny about the word barrister. No journalist can write barrister without put high flying above it.
High flying,
high flying, but it's like low to middle flying mostly.
In my eyes, you're high flying. But to have you representing a vision for farming, both of you, that is about truly sustainable farming and nutritious farming. I think that's really exciting from my perspective of 30 years. And when I started 30 years ago, there were very few people talking about farming. So now we've got a lot of people talking about it, but there's a lot of debate. So the more we understand, the better. I did want us to be all understanding what we mean when we're talking about sort of regenerative systems. There's organic farming, which is based on a legal set of standards which are enforced by a third party. But that's one thing, and it's also sort of a marketing tool as well. But regenerative is also being talked about a lot now as a really good way of helping farmers on a transition to a sustainable farming system. So I wanted our authors to say what the core tenets of the sustainable or regenerative farming system they would like to be promoting.
I think the easy answer is that regenerative farming regenerates. It puts back in more than it takes out. Farming is extractive. Almost everything we do is extractive. And the best definition I've heard is from a guy called George Young, who used to be a banker, and then he went and became a farmer, and he's been doing it for well over a decade now. And he measures it by saying if you do your baseline at the beginning of your rotation, and your baseline being your soil organic matter, your biodiversity, and then at the end of your rotation you do your baseline again. If it's greater, then over the course of your rotation you're putting more in than you're extracting out. And someone like Gabe Brown, who is, demigod of regenerative farming, he has given principles like keep the soil covered, ensure that there are living roots in the ground all year round, minimal interference with the soil, whether that's chemical or mechanical, and of course the very strong final principle of that, which is why we're here, is integrating livestock. One of his principles about regenerative farming is that livestock must be integrated in the system, whether that's arable, pasture, or a combination. So we haven't got to the point yet where it's regulated. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, but having stood in the middle of organic and conventional farmers, they've only been conventional for 70 years, but let's not tell them that. I know how loaded the term organic is.
Yeah.
Our farm is organic. We converted it to organic because at the time we made the decision, we thought it was the best way to farm with nature. I also know how tight the lip curl is on the face of some conventional farmers I know when you say the word organic, and the stigma that organic carries with it. This doesn't feel like this in the city because it's a sort of way of signifying your worth or your righteousness if you order something organic in the city. It's not like that in many other parts of the country that I've been to, where organic is a joke. And it was so much of a joke back in the 80s when it was originally regulated, it was the muck and magic. I mean, it had no credibility. It's still only 3% of all farms in the UK are organic. However, the EU has just committed to turning 25%, so 1 in every 4 farms organic by, I think it's 2030, which is really not that far away.
It's not policy, it's just a strategy.
Yeah. I see regenerative a little bit as a bridge between organic and conventional, because one of the principles of regenerative is to dramatically reduce your inputs. So you work with natural systems, which of course is an organic method. You try and integrate livestock rather than using artificial fertilizer, which of course is an organic method. But what it has managed to do is integrate no-till. You don't plough the soil. We have an arable farm, we plough. And I know how bad that is, and I write about it. And I write about how ploughing the soil disrupts fungal pathways, it releases carbon into the atmosphere, it has many demerits in it. But if I can't plough, then I have to spray with herbicide. And we are trying all sorts of ways of doing it. We're trying pasture cropping, and we're trying a living mulch and all sorts of other ways. But I see regenerative, in a way, as a way of enabling farmers who are very far over that side to come further towards a natural way of farming.
That's a great description. Do you want to add what you'd say? Well, your system is American system of farming.
I mean, it's interesting because I was also going to talk about Gabe Brown, but I was going to say something totally different. He's written an amazing book called Dirt to Soil, and I have not been on his farm, but I've met him several times, and I've moderated panels that he was on. And his book, Dirt to Soil, by the way, is also by Chelsea Green. It's another wonderful book that you should add to your reading list if you haven't read it already. But the thing that he said on the panel that I was moderating in Kentucky with him a couple of years ago, that I just thought was such a beautiful and wonderful way of describing it. He took a conventional farm that was just soybeans and corn in North Dakota, and he just had married into it, basically. So it was sort of like he was just moved there and basically tried to continue doing what had been done for a long time. And he decided fairly quickly on that this was not a very good system. Like, it was losing money, and it was taking a lot of chemicals and everything, and he began to try to move away from that. And looking back on the journey that he took over the last couple of decades, he describes it as when he was a conventional farmer, he woke up every morning thinking about what he was going to kill that day. You know, which insect pest, which fungal pest, which plant pest, i.e. weed, he was going to kill with an herbicide, a pesticide, you know, whatever. And then he realized at some point that he had moved into a very different mind frame on his farm, which is to think about and notice and celebrate all of the life that was happening, all of the diversity, all of the different plants he'd never seen before, plants that hadn't been on the farm in over 100 years, insects that were returning, wildlife that was returning, water that was, you know, now available on the farm that hadn't been during the conventional years. And so, to me, he's this beautiful example and spokesperson for how regenerative farming is about the life and sort of fostering life and diversity versus simplicity and the killing and stomping out of everything you're trying, you know, everything that's alive on the farm except that one thing you're trying to produce, which is the conventional approach. And so there's a lot more to be said about this, but I think that's kind of a beautiful illustration to me of the difference.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I've always been promoting organic farming through these years, and I did speak to an organic farmer recently about how they felt about this issue of tilling, the ploughing and destroying the soil. He said, well, if you're an organic farmer, you've created a soil that's so great, the ploughing doesn't hurt you so much. That's, you know, you've been doing it for 10, like many decades.
I think we're hoping for 1 year in 5. Yeah. We're hoping to plough 1 year in 5.
That's a solution. Great. That's a good
What's
one.
interesting, I should say, like, Gabe Brown is obviously, he's everyone's gateway book. He's the book you sneak onto your farm manager's desk, hoping that he might pick it up, because it's very accessible. Yeah. But also, what's important about Gabe Brown, and also lots of the farmers, I guess, in Rooted, is that he had to change. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a moment where he woke up and loved bees. Like, he had an entire season of hailstorms, which wiped out his whole crop. And And then he had it was so incredibly unlucky, because I don't think his neighbour had it. He had another hailstorm, which wiped out the following year's crop. And they were hemorrhaging money. And it's a bit, I don't know who here is familiar with NEP. Isabella Trees and Charlie Burrell's farm. Isabella Tree, the author of Wilding. That was a commercial dairy, losing £35,000 a year. They were forced to rewild. There was no other financial option open to them. And a lot of the farmers that I came across had this really sliding doors moment where they either sell the farm with all the legacy and baggage that goes with it, their great-great-great-great-grandfather looking down on them saying, how could you lose it? Or they do it differently. And I think what has been so incredibly compelling about regenerative farming is you can see it on the balance sheet. It's right there. The artificial fertilizer, which is now 4 times more expensive this year than it was last year. The glyphosate, which is 3 times more expensive and doesn't work because all the weeds have become resistant. It's there on the balance sheet. And so that is, that is a compelling process. Now, for a long time, we've been getting a big fat check in December, which has allowed us to hemorrhage money. We're not going to get that anymore.
Yeah. Well, basic payment scheme.
I want to just say something about something Sarah just said, which I think is really important. There are many kind of common narratives about agriculture and about food production. And one of them is that conventional... Are you okay, Aggie?
There's some water here.
Conventional agriculture, we are told over and over again, is necessary to feed the world.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's necessary economically for farmers. But I think the biggest opportunity to dramatically change farming and agriculture and food production is precisely the fact that more and more farmers have recognized that it is not financially viable. And so Gabe Brown is just one example of a farmer who sort of, for just strictly financial reasons at the beginning, but then it became this whole life-changing journey for him, had said, we were told this. We were told this at agricultural college. We've been told this by the representatives of the government for decades, that this was necessary to survive. And they've recognized, the thing that it's sort of weird we keep talking about Gabe Brown, but he is this amazing example, But he talks so much about the financial benefits for their family as well, and also the quality of the food that they were producing, which I think is a very important part of the conversation that often gets left out when we talk about the environmental side of it. Because he recognized that, first of all, he wasn't even producing food for humans at all on his farm. It was feed, not food. And then he began to actually raise food, and that the food was demonstrably more nourishing than anything that was being produced in his region by himself or other people, because they had so much more biological activity in the soil, and he was using different kinds of seed varieties and breed varieties, etc. And so he could actually show that he was producing healthier and more nutrient-rich food. So there are these really compelling reasons, and I think when we have these older, angry, absolutely, farmers, I totally get it, because I've talked to many of them and visited many of their farms over the years. But I also find it incredibly hopeful that many of the younger people I meet that are entering agriculture or entering the whole food world have a very different perspective, and they look at that experiment with fossil fuels and chemistry, etc., as failed. It's just very, very clear to many people coming into farming and agriculture that was a failed experiment that lasted for decades, but it's very clear now that it failed. So I think the financial argument is one that's kind of being turned around. It hasn't been fully. I mean, you can go to any conventional agriculture conference in the world right at this moment, and they'll be talking about how imperative it is financially to use all these chemicals. I mean, it's not like the issue's gone away, but the sort of vapidness of it, it's just the emptiness of it has become more and more apparent. And so even a lot of people very wedded to conventional agriculture are beginning to acknowledge, the fact that those are false promises.
I think it's absolutely true.
So that's a reason for hope.
Yeah,
because it's a tremendous opportunity for change. And when we talk about government policy or consumer actions and all those things, it's like it's ripe right now for dramatic change. And I think that, the optimism that I haven't read your book yet. I'm looking forward to reading it because it hasn't even been in my hands until today. But I believe that from what you've said tonight, you have a lot of optimism. And I have a lot of optimism as well about where this can all go because of the fact that it's kind of gotten to a crisis point and people have begun to recognize the causes and some of the solutions, I think.
Yeah, I think reading Sarah's book, you talk about the cracks that happen. People these cracks, something, the whole pig herd dies, things like horrendous things, cracks, and then it lets the light in, something changes. And I think it's beautifully described in many stories and very powerful. I was crying, and then there was hope in the end of all of them. One of the common threads is the diversity, going towards more diversity in farming. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you is how would you think we get these stories to people so they're buying and eating and buying differently, changing where they buy from, changing what they buy, so they're actually and understanding and sharing that and having less ultra-processed foods, things like that, but because they've read the stories. And I was just wondering how we could reach people more. Do you think we've got any ideas of that?
You write a book.
Apart from reading this book, that's the number one answer. Is there any others? Because so many people are online these days.
I think I think like every solution, like every complicated problem, there are multiple solutions, and I think that humans are story-led.
Yeah.
Every lawyer will know. I mean, I was a showing off lawyer, so I had a wig and a gown and told stories. You probably did extremely complicated things in legal argument, but ultimately, what you're trying to do is reach the human level with somebody. It's what I try to do with a judge and a jury every day, and it's what you probably tried to do exactly that in your previous role as well, which is to access that part of common ground, the grey between you. And I think it's a trite thing to say we live in this polarised world because everyone's saying it all the time at the moment. And I think that's definitely true on social media. I don't think it's true face to face. And so when we're talking about meat, which is a loaded subject, has been a loaded subject for an extremely long time and has a fascinating history in terms of that background, it's easy for us, I think, to look at the public presence of that debate on social media and think it's polarised. That when you're able to have the space to have a debate like we're having tonight, I think there's far more common ground, actually, than people think there is.
Yeah. I think one of the big campaigns is to get people to be appreciated as citizen consumers. They're not just consumers. I mean, we talked about consumers. That's how the industry like to see us. But we're citizens, and we can think about things far more complex than just the choice we make in the shop. Although just the choice people make in the shop is very complex in itself.
It's a minefield.
It is a minefield.
We were saying, it is. Every choice we make has a ripple.
Yeah.
Whether it's the clothes we wear, the holiday we go on, what we put in our mouth, where we live, and it's sometimes I find it, easy to get completely weighed down by that responsibility to the point where you're in a freeze state. You feel like you can't move at all. And I think one of the problems with the meat debate is that it can cause that stasis where you don't move forward with it.
I mean, this is something we could talk about. I know you're very interested in the issue of the campaigns that are talking about less and better. I'm part of a campaign about less and better meat, or better and less meat, whichever way you want to do it. And we've seen that as a very useful tool to talk to people, to get to talk to people about the meat they're eating and the dairy as well. But you're worried about that approach, I think.
Yeah, actually, it's sort of funny because in my first book, I used that exact phrase. I said, yes, we should eat less and better, basically. And I've thought more and more about this over the last, 15 years or whatever, since that first book came out, and I've increasingly moved away from that, and I actually view it as a mistake that I ever said that. And the reason is because I actually have an essay sitting on my desktop on my computer, which has been there for about 5 years, which I periodically work on, and then I put it back, which I've never published, which is on this very issue, why I don't believe eat less meat is good advice. And that's basically the core of something I just keep thinking about. But there's much to say about it. But I just wanted to make 2 key points, because I think these are the most important ones. Number 1, when you say eat less meat, it's very often associated with this notion that meat is inherently problematic. Just like you might say, we really should be smoking fewer cigarettes. We should be eating less sugar. We should be eating less meat. We should smoke less. Are those statements really equivalent? And what that has done is, having visited for the last 20-some years farmers and ranchers all over the world, is it has made the farming and ranching community feel under attack. And not just like they're being attacked, but they are actually being told they're doing something unethical. They're doing something maybe even immoral by raising animals for food. Apart from the issue of whether it's morally appropriate to eat animals, but just because it's bad for our health or it's bad for the environment, and therefore we should do less and less. And if you must eat a little bit, okay, but really eat as little as you possibly can. That is a message that's everywhere, certainly here in the UK and also in the US. Not quite as much. It's actually more prevalent here from what I've seen. But what that does is so I am working every day with farmers and ranchers, many of whom are multi-generational families that have been carrying on the ranching, but they are literally working their fingers to the bone to make beautiful, healthy food and take care of that land and provide for their families. And someone in Washington, D.C. is saying, I'm doing something immoral. My very existence is a moral offense. Okay? So this is the number 1 reason I really despise the eat less meat phrase or campaign. Okay? But the other reason I've thought about this, that I find it so troubling, is because when we're talking on the consumer side, this came up last night actually at an event that I did. Someone was asking me about change and how we make the change. And I said, part of the reason I'm so concerned about the eat less meat message is it tells the most educated and motivated and resourced consumer, who has the capacity with their wallet to rebuild the food system with their choices, that they should eat less meat. And that is exactly the consumer that can afford to buy the meat from places like my ranch, okay? And if they're told, well, it's okay to eat a little bit of meat if you must, but you just eat a little bit, and it's going to cost more, and so that's good, you've just balanced it all out, which is essentially what I said in my first book, by the way. And that's basically how I argued it. Like, it's going to be the same amount in your budget, and you're just going to eat less, and it's going to be higher quality, and you're going to pay more for it, and it's all going to be great. But I don't believe that anymore, because it is desperately needed for consumers to resource this revolution that we also desperately need. And I believe, the book is all about the reasons ecologically and from a nutritional standpoint why the animals in the food system are so important. So I don't view it as reduce the animals because we need to mitigate their harm. I view it all about the how. When they're raised the right way, they are inherently ecologically beneficial and incredibly important in terms of providing nourishing food for humans. And so if we tell the consumer that has the capacity to finance that revolution that they shouldn't even be doing that, the revolution's not going to happen. So those are my 2 main reasons, but I have about 50 that are sitting on this essay that I haven't figured out how to package into a nice 1,000-word piece that the New York Times can run. So that's why it hasn't been published yet.
Very interested to read that when it comes out. I'm very interested to read how we transition the amount that people eat from the bad stuff, which dominates completely people's diets, to the good stuff, and in all sorts of ways, and the land use and water use and all those kind of things, because it's a huge amount of beef if people can go to beef instead of chicken or whatever. But I'll read that in your essay.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about the lesson better?
I think that what's really interesting is that if I asked everybody here if I said the word meat and get you to create a picture in your mind, I bet it's a slab of kind of bloody flesh, like cow flesh. And I think inherent within the eat less meat which I also have said, and I personally think we should just consume less of everything, that we've been on an orgy of consumption for about 2 decades. But and that ties into food waste, which I'd very much like to talk about later. But one of the things I think happens when you say eat less meat is that they choose chicken because that's meat light. That's not bloody. It doesn't really look like flesh. It comes vacuum packed in a nice packet. And you can sort of pretend it never really belonged to an animal at all. I've been to lots of different farms, and I've stood inside an industrial poultry unit, and I've smelt the ammonia on me for days afterwards, and I've raised chickens myself and have butchered one. Well, okay, I got my husband to do it, but I held up the book as he did it with the pictures that made it look like an IKEA flat pack, and it wasn't like that at all. And there's definitely blood. And I can take you to farms all over this country with cows on it who have transformed the land, transformed the soil so that you can dig into something that looks like chocolate cake full of worms that wasn't like that before. The symbiotic nature between the plants and the animals grazing the plants has worked its magic. And what is astonishing is how fast it happens. I think I've seen it happen within a couple of years, the transformation between something that's either overgrazed or cropped and how it looks afterwards. And the hedgerows and what huge life that supports. Because I think we English or British people who travel around the countryside or look at pictures of Cornwall with nice hedgerows, it's really unusual. Not much of the world has that. We are gifted these extraordinary biodiversity corridors that run throughout most of our countryside. And they are there ostensibly to keep livestock in. They were in the first place. And you know in your gut which is a better system, which is a system which is giving more back than it's taking. And I'm not a nutritionist, and I know that in your book, Nicolette, you talk about nutrition and you're much more better than I am about the statistics of it. But in terms of when we're talking about complicated studies that have always put a big cow at the top of the chain and then a little chicken at the bottom of the chain in terms of harm, and it's measured in either protein or kilograms, and you think that the kilogram of that is not the same as the kilogram of a carrot, or not the same as a kilogram of a soybean protein. And I think when I came back to London, I remember the thing that made me want to write the book the most was I was sitting on a tube just after Veganuary, and there were lots of extremely brightly coloured adverts from fast food chains advertising Veganuary, and they were very conspiratorial, like we were in on the joke, because those silly parochial people who were still eating meat hadn't really caught up on hadn't intellectualized themselves out of such behaviour. And one of them is like, the cow pat has hit the fan, or don't be a carnivore. Yeah. And I had just visited a massive estate in North Norfolk which grows vegetables. And I write about it in the book. And I stood in the field, and the guy who had taken me was the third generation coming in, and he was really troubled by what they were doing, and so he was wanting to change his system but couldn't work out how. And the field was one of those Norfolk fields where you literally can't see the beginning and the end. It's like America. It's like a huge plain. And there was a machine sieving the soil because they were going to plant either potatoes or carrots in there afterwards. And I could put my hand in the soil. I did it. Put it all the way nearly up to my elbow because there was nothing left. It was basically hydroponics. So when that vegetable is going to be planted, it will be sprayed into life. And the whole farm was irrigated. So a huge amount of water loss, obviously, for irrigation. And at the end, according to if that farm did what, there was a report came out in 21 that was WWF and Tesco looked at food waste on farm, so all the way through. And that the vegetables in that field, according to that report, 40% would be lost or wasted. And I know that there was no biodiversity in that field. I did not see a bug, I did not see an insect, and I did not see a bird. And he said to me, my farm manager says that we don't really get worms here. Because the sand, the soil is a bit sandy, they don't really like it. But what they had got is quite good cover for shooting by the side of the hedgerows. So they've got some old hedgerows, and I went, you could scoop up the soil, I didn't need to dig it, but I said, can we dig there by the hedge, a metre away? And he dug up a square and flipped it over, and there were worms. And I thought, and look, that's where we
just
be.
disproved his point.
Yeah, it was, I'm not going to say it wasn't a deeply satisfying moment.
I mean, the reality is that the horticulture industry has been under even greater cost than the beef and sheep industry because it hasn't had any subsidies. Talk about the UK, unlike cereals and beef and sheep, they've had subsidies for the last 50 years. So they're actually under the pressure of incredibly low prices and demands, cosmetic demands. You would have a perfect carrot, a perfect all that kind of thing, which leads to the waste. So, and that's also the pressure on meat producers. They've got to produce, they've got extra subsidies, but they've still got to produce, lowest cost, specifications, absolute specifications, perfect weight going into slaughter, and all these kind of things. I think, for me, a lot of the problems lie in the supply chain, what's happening in the supply chain and how that's driving both what farmers do and what the consumers are expecting in the shop. And they advertise, they spend billions on advertising for a reason, because it really works. You buy all that produce. So I wanted to ask you what you think the solutions are. I mean, it's, so you could talk about solutions to waste if you wanted to talk about that, but what other solutions can we think of to solve the problems that farmers are constantly under this pressure, and they're not represented in the shop shelf? Any sort of thoughts about where we should go? I mean, there's labelling, there's banning things. We could ban factory farming, we could ban intensive plant things like that. So what are your ideas?
Well, I mean, obviously there's somewhat, the problems are somewhat different in the United States, and the solutions are somewhat different, but I think there are some commonalities. I mean, I think one of the things I've realized working on this for the last 20 years is that people feel it's such a big problem, it's overwhelming, like you can't possibly fix this, it's just too big. So people kind of throw up their hands, whether they're policymakers or consumers. But at the same time, I think the solutions are there and have to be done in concert, so every person in this room is probably a voter, except possibly my son who's only 13. But we're citizens, and we're also consumers. We're definitely all consumers, including my 13-year-old son. Okay, so we have at least those two roles that we can personally affect in terms of the choices that we're making. And as I was saying earlier, I think we can contribute to building that better food system. So I really emphasize that for the role of the consumer. And taking the time to seek out the well-raised foods. And there are many different ways to do that. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with all those things. But I also think we all have a role as citizens to speak to our elected officials about what we don't want and what we do want in the food system, and to have that be a higher priority in policy making. And it's super interesting, the discussion about the subsidies in the UK. We're not doing that at all in the United States, and I'm super intrigued to see where that goes, because I think we in the US, we basically are just in this very old mindset of subsidizing production, quantity-wise. And there's there's tiny little programs about sort of ecologically based subsidies. And I'm actually, everybody's always kind of like talking negatively about Biden these days. But one of the things he did right away when he came into office is he said, we're going to try to incentivize better farming. So there were all kinds of things that were immediately introduced in terms of incentivizing more carbon going into the soil. And this is something we're doing in a lot of states, in like California where I live, on a state level. So I think that there are things that can be banned, like the use of antibiotics in feed and drink and things like that for the livestock. So I think it's a lot of different approaches, and they need to be done all together. But I think that the big enemy is sort of inertia. We all think, well, it's overwhelming. We cannot change this. because I actually see this revolution building and bubbling up from the young people and from young farmers, young chefs. We work with a lot of chefs directly. And the passion and the energy is astonishing. So I have a lot of optimism, and I think it's kind of all of this that needs to be done collectively. And I think, again, to sort of hammer my point, I don't think eating less meat or telling people to eat less meat helps any of what needs to happen to get us to a truly regenerative and healthy food system. So I think it's about building that better food system. How do we get there?
We have more chances now with digital, with the whole technology. You can do more direct sales as well. Some farmers are doing that very well. It's an opportunity to actually choose to buy from a particular producer.
And that's one of the many, like my husband is, created this company that just brought together farms. And so, as I mentioned before, there are hundreds of farms in this network. And to me, what was, so beautiful about it is it allowed the farmers to continue to do what they wanted to do, which was be on the farm and raise the animals, not worry about the marketing, not worry about the
Somebody
distribution.
else is doing that.
Exactly, bringing them together. Yeah. So lots of different kinds of solutions.
We have something here that's just grown and grown and grown called Better Food Traders, which is doing that job for farmers because they don't want to be traders or retailers.
Right.
Exactly. Do you have any particular solutions you want to promote? And then I'm going to ask you for questions, so have a think about all your questions.
I don't think inertia is, in our age of social media, I don't think inertia, I hope, is a problem. I do think people find it difficult to get reliable information. And I remember someone saying to me, it doesn't matter, nothing matters after the but. You can say, yes, that's true, but no one listens to that bit. I mean, that's how Brexit happened. People were able to get a slogan and slap it on something, and it's too late after the event to say, yeah, I didn't mean quite that.
Take back control.
Take back control, I didn't mean quite that. And I think that is what is happening with the debate to an extent about farming and meat is both of us I've chucked it in a reference, but of course you've talked about it before. The reason we're probably here tonight is because of the 2006 UN report, Livestock's Long Shadow, which was a report that said that the greenhouse gas emissions of livestock are globally more than all the planes, trains, automobiles in the world. That's not true. It took them a couple of years to say it wasn't true. In the UK, just
the authors.
Yes.
The authors said,
yes.
Oops,
yes.
That was a mistake.
A few years after everybody
that's hammered home.
Pointed it out. And just to give you an idea of how wrong that is, I mean, in England alone, transport emissions are 24%. I wrote this all down to make sure I wasn't caught out. But transport emissions are something like 24%. Business is 19%. Agriculture in total is 10%. Livestock from that is about 5%. Food waste globally is 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So globally, the food we waste releases as many greenhouse gas emissions, or not as many, slightly less than making the food in the first place. Last year, I think it was last year, Oatly ran an advert on British TV, and it was an advert which raised the generational difference between father and son. A father crept into a kitchen and surreptitiously opened his fridge in the dark and took out, or put in, I think, a bottle of cow's milk. And then a light went on in the corner and his son was there. And he remonstrated with his dad and said, how could you do this? And the statistic that flashed up on the screen was that 2006 statistic, which is that cows, that dairy in the livestock industry is a greater producer of greenhouse gas emissions. That had already been disproved. It had already been, all you need to do is go on the government website and you'll see that it's not true. It doesn't matter. It's still out there. And Oatly, the advert was banned, partly because it had got incorrect fats in it, but they still felt that they could use it. And so I don't think it's inertia that's the problem. I think it's too much action in a way. It's too many misleading statistics. And so I do think labelling is going to be part of the corrective for that. And one of the examples I always think is really powerful is eggs. When we had caged eggs, most people in Britain bought caged eggs. And then there was an industry-led directive which meant you had to label free-range eggs and caged eggs.
It's an EU directive.
I think it was an industry-led one, but it was the EU one that came in. Okay. Okay.
It was illegally binding.
All the good stuff, basically, came from you. And now the entry point is free-range.
Yeah.
The entry point, and it happened over 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's one industry. Yeah.
It happened over. But when people were in front of two egg boxes, and one said free range and one says caged, they made their choice based on the information they were given. And we don't have that choice given to us that often when we buy food. Not least because a large amount of food we eat now is in restaurants. And we eat out many more times than my parents did, or in that generation. So information, I think, clear information is going to be one of the solutions. And I would say the other solution is maybe a bit more nebulous. But for me, and it sounds like for you as well, all of this happened because I refound a connection to the natural world that I had lost. And there is a poem, one of my favourite poems by Mary Oliver, has a line that says, attention is the beginning of devotion. When you pay attention to something, you can't care about something unless you feel it and see it and hear it and have a connection to it, are rooted to it. When we are so disconnected to our natural world, it's very hard for us to see us as part of that natural world. And of course we are, and so are the things we eat, and so are the livestock that are part of that system, and we both use our ash to ash, dust to dust about the system we are part of that we have become so disconnected from. It goes round and round. And I think if we are able to try and reintegrate nature into our lives, that will be part of us refinding our connection to our food.
Wonderful. That's a lovely point at which to open up to the audience for questions.